J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace, and you are in part 2 of 2 episodes that we're doing related to the non-canonical Gospels, ancient texts written about Jesus that really challenge what we know about Jesus from the New Testament. Last week we talked about some of the reasons why some people will actually kind of jump in and be inclined to want to at least examine and maybe even trust what the non-canonicals have to say, and why that should not persuade you that the non-canonicals are true. And we're also going to talk a little bit more about the contents of our book, Person of Interest, where I really dive into the non-canonicals and what they can tell us. And here's why. It turns out that the stuff that you probably think, if you're not a believer and you've got friends in your life who aren't believers, the stuff that you think is important in your world, if you were like me as an atheist for all those years, were things like literature and music and art and education and science and philosophy. These are all things that were huge to me. And I was even interested in some of the, people, if you said, well, the Baha'u'llah, for example, this is a theologian in a sense, he says he's a manifestation of God. We can forget about that. But he had some ancient truths that even he would pass on. Like, all these things have enriched our lives as human beings on planet Earth. And it turns out that no one has had an impact on those things more than Jesus of Nazareth. And the story of Jesus can be completely to the high level reconstructed in its great detail from just those aspects of culture that you probably don't even think have been affected by Jesus. If you had every New Testament document destroyed and there's not a single manuscript or Bible available to anyone on planet Earth, you could still reconstruct the story of Jesus in great detail from just those aspects of culture that you don't even think he has an impact on. And one of them is literature. And the ancient literature, the current literature, Christ figures in current fiction, these are all places that no one has been written about more. No historical figure has been written about more than Jesus of Nazareth. Period. Globally, no one has had this impact on literature. And so you could reconstruct the story of Jesus even from the most unlikely places like heretical movements, which most of these non-canonicals were. So our book, Person of Interest, is available. Go to our personofinterestbook.com website, personofinterestbook.com, and you will see the information there to order the pre-order. We've provided, I think, a pretty good pre-order package, which is a free ebook, a free video, free Bible inserts, and membership to our community is discounted by 40% if you get the pre-order. And the idea there is we want to build a private social media platform that is uncancelable, that is not going to be, you're not the focus of advertising there. We're not there to advertise to you. We're going to give you exclusive materials, and we're going to train you up and mentor you as a Christian case maker. That's all on our personal community, our private community at coldcasechristianity.com. So join us there. Take a look at it. I think you'll find it very, very much worth your time. Okay, all that being said, what we want to do in this episode is take a look at some of the reasons. Number one, should we be worried? Does this challenge the historicity of Jesus in any way? Well, that's what we talk about. And by the way, the footnotes alone in Person of Interest, I think, are almost twice as long as the actual text. So long, in fact, to separate it as a PDF file, because I wanted to give you every bit of detail about what has been said about Jesus in the non-canonical Gospels. All of that is available to you in the book. All right. That being said, we'll take a quick break, and I want to help you to understand. Number one, does this really impact? And how do we tell how can we think clearly about how we should either embrace or not embrace the non-canonicals? We'll do that right after the break. Coming this fall, join me, J. Warner Wallace, on a 10-part journey based on my book, Person of Interest. We'll investigate a real homicide together, and we'll also examine the unparalleled impact Jesus had on human history. We'll trace the fuse that burned toward the disappearance of Tammy Hayes, then sift through the fallout that eventually implicated her husband. In a similar way, we'll examine the historical fuse that burned toward the appearance of Jesus and marvel at the fallout and unexpected impact Jesus had on our world. Finally, we'll ask the critical question, Does Jesus still matter in a world that's increasingly skeptical of the Bible? Let's discover if Jesus is history's true person of interest.
All right, last one, and I'd appreciate if you stayed in your seat this
Okay.
time. Oh my God. I've got witnesses. Several people wrote in, I think they're leading questions, but they're like, so what?
Yeah.
Sort of like you asked him, so what? You wrote this book about this. So what if God's the answer to this?
So that's the question. So yeah.
So what?
Got it. Well, okay. Let me ask you a question. Do you think it matters? Do you think we would behave differently if none of us believed there was any purpose to life? Do you think we'd behave differently? I think you would. Now, why do we think there's a purpose to life? You can say, well, I create my own purpose to life. Really? Okay, so if I find something up here, see how he set me up? So if I was to find out something, let's say I was to come alongside this, and I discover this thing sitting on the counter, okay? And here it is. It's this little widget. So here's a little widget here, it's sitting here, and I'm finding out on the camera, I'm like, dang, what is that for? What is the purpose of this widget? If you didn't know the purpose of this widget, honestly, you didn't know, but you wanted to find out tonight what the purpose of the widget is, what would you do? What would you? You'd Google it. No, listen. Okay, but you could do that. Look, I could say, well, look, it could be a number of things. I could use it to hold open a door. It's a door, it's got an angle. I could put it in doorstop. I could find other uses for this. I could. I could use it to prop up my keyboard. I could find other uses, but I really want to know what was it designed for, because it seems to me I'll get the most out of it if I know what its intended purpose was. Well, how do I find that? You're going to Google it. Okay, fine. So how are you going to Google it? What are you going to look for? What if I told you that there was a manufacturer on the side? You type this in, right? Okay, fine. So now it turns out what you're thinking is that the best way to discover the purpose of this widget is to ask the manufacturer. Okay. So now you know why it matters. Okay, I want to start by just kind of giving you an idea of what motivates people to write a heresy about Jesus, to twist the story of Jesus. It's just not like this is unusual, right? I mean, there are times when, do you remember, was it Abraham Lincoln? There was a movie about Abraham Lincoln, like as a zombie killer. It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek, campy horror movie, right? But why would somebody seek to change the Abraham Lincolns? Now you could say, well, of course, that's just for play. But actually, there were some motivations to do that were financial, that were based, I always say that every lie written about anybody, every lie told by anybody is told for one of three reasons, the same three reasons that motivate all bad behavior. If you know my work, you probably already know what I'm going to say. It's going to be financial greed, sexual lust, the pursuit of power. Those are the only three reasons. And I get pushback on YouTube all the time about this. Well, what about vengeance or jealousy or all of those things are downstream from sex, money, power. Sorry, they are. And that power issue is the thing that is so huge that sometimes you think, Well, is that power? Yeah, actually it is. And so I've written an article about the non-canonicals here. It's on our website. What motivated early non-canonical writers to modify the story of Jesus? What motivated early non-canonical writers? Well, okay, look, I don't talk about this in this particular article, but it's always going to be sex, money, power. And it turns out that it's very specific. We see the kinds of modifications that are made to the Jesus story that are present in the non-canonical Gospels. I mean, you can read them. I've got an entire section at coldcasechristianity.com that's just devoted to the non-canonicals. In every single non-canonical, I jump in and I show you, here's what it says about Jesus. Here's what it gets wrong. Here's what it gets right. Here's why the earliest Christians who knew better rejected this text and what evidence they based their rejection on. And lastly, what details about Jesus could you mine out of this? In other words, what are the truths about Jesus that the liar has to stand on before he can tell his lie? Because it turns out, if we can get back to the base of the truths about Jesus that the liar has to stand on, well, then every non-canonical gospel, and earlier the better. If you skeptics think these are early, well, the earlier the better, because it turns out these are early confirmations about the Jesus story from people who sought to twist the story. Well, why would they twist it? That's what I want to talk about with you next. And that is based on one of those three motivations. Now, when you look at the details related to what they say, the non-canonicals say, you can really see what they're trying to do, and then you can relate that to what motivates them. I'm going to give you three things that the non-canonical authors were trying to do in creating their stories in the non-canonical texts, and then you can see how these are connected to various of our three motives for misbehavior. The first thing they were trying to do often was just to fill in gaps. A lot of these non-canonicals just fill in gaps, right? I mean, there's some stuff missing in the Gospels. You know, what happens after the baptism of Jesus until that scene where he's at 12 years old and he's in the temples being instructing the rabbis. What happens in there? There's 12 years that are missing. And then after that, it seems like we don't have any information for another, 18 years until he's 30? That's a lot of detail that's missing about the life of Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Like, why? Like, people had questions about that. And there are some non-canonical Gospels that are written in an effort to fill in those gaps. Now, they're late in history, but the point is, they are written to fill, and they're fanciful stories. Lots of stories about Jesus, creating birds from clay or mud, about Jesus angrily, striking someone down as a child. I mean, there's all kinds of fanciful stories. They're in the non-canonicals. They're interesting. But why would somebody do that? What would drive you to do that? Well, look, a lot of what we talk about in the pursuit of power is nuanced. Gnosticism in general, this idea that salvation is found through some set of hidden truth claims that only esoteric claims that only a select few are privileged to know. That's a power issue, right? I know something that you don't know, that if you want to know, you need to join our group so I can reveal this to you in the scripture that's unique to our group. A lot of what we're seeing in the writing of the non-canonicals falls into this power issue. That I have a set of facts, a set of details, especially those non-canonical Gospels, and that's probably most of them, that are claiming that Jesus somehow revealed wisdom statements to a select few of his followers, and some of these statements are bizarre. But the idea is that you, in order to be saved, you need to come into this knowledge, which we protect here in our small community, and is only available to you through our scripture, which is in the form of one of these non-canonical Gospels. Can you see how that would be a power issue? How that would be something that people would want to protect and leverage over a group? You got to join our group to have access to this scripture that then becomes, and by the way, you'll see that this scripture was being used protectively in a region. So it's clear that this is a group that wants you to join their group in order to have this esoteric private knowledge. So that's the first thing. You'll see that some people are simply filling in gaps, and that really is motivated by, it seems to me, a sense of wanting to be in a position where I know something that you don't know, I hold this position, I hold this information, and therefore that's why I'm telling you the lie. But they get a little more. Those that fill in knowledge, that fill in gaps in the narrative, that's interesting to me, but it gets more bizarre the more you read these non-canonicals. Let me give you another motivation, another reason why they wrote these anyway, and that is that some just wanted to support a heresy altogether. And what I mean is These were people who held to a heretical view of God, or held to a view of God, let's say, or they held to a religious worldview, that they felt that if they could just co-opt the Jesus story and have Jesus repeat the worldview they already held, that it would lend credence to the worldview they already held in advance. Well, what is that driving? Now, that happened a lot in the non-canonicals. People who held a heretical view of God, or they held a heretical, just a worldview that they, like Gnosticism. Don't forget, Paul often is writing about how Gnostics were trying to pervert the story of Jesus. Even on the pages of New Testament Scripture, you kind of see there's a sense in which Gnostic principles are being argued against by Paul. Well, there are entire groups that full-born just took the story of Jesus and changed them to fit their views of matter and how matter is treated, of esoteric knowledge and how it's distributed. These are things that these Gnostic groups and that these heretical groups really believed about reality to begin with, and they simply co-opted Jesus to give their beliefs authority. Now, what would motivate that? Well, again, if you're looking for someone's authority, if I'm trying to borrow the authority of Jesus to convince people, that's a power issue, right? That's a power issue. I want you to believe me, and you know what? This is going to be more credible if Jesus said it. Well, then I can actually leverage the authority of Jesus, the power of Jesus, to leverage for my own power. That's part of the reason why you see these non-canonicals being written. Let me give you a third reason, and that is that they were acquiring power from an esoteric secret. Now, this is a third reason why you see these are being written. Either they're supporting a heresy, they're filling in gaps and details, or they are actually just aiming at power in the secrets that they are saying, oh, if you don't know my secrets and you can only learn them from me, you can't be saved. This is going to be enlightened. You will be enlightened and saved only if you know the secrets that I know that I'm going to deliver to you through this document or through this scripture I'm going to read in a setting, whatever it is. That's just clearly a power play there, right? But look, sometimes I think we have a tendency to think that power is just power and it's not related to sex or money. But it turns out, like I've talked about before, I've got the thing called the challenge of celebrity. It's on our website, and it's on our YouTube channel, and it's also on the NRB archive. And that challenge of celebrity is a challenge because you seldom do one of those three things. You seldom are motivated to pursue one of these three things without activating a pursuit of one of the other two. If I have power, well, then I can leverage it to get paid something, to get money, to get sex. And you often see people who are pursuing power, and once they've acquired it, they can leverage it to get other things in the trilogy of terror there, known as sex, money, and power. So I just think it's important for us to realize that although it might just be, well, it's obviously power, but don't be too quick about that. Power can then sometimes be leveraged for something else. But those are the three goals of Gnostic writers. Number one, either just power grab from esoteric information, which is not very often the case. It was, I'm going to fill in some details so I can tell you something I think I know that you don't know, or I have a heresy I'm bringing to the table anyway. I just want to co-opt Jesus to be the authority in my heresy. Those are the things you see with the non-canonical gospel authors. Take a break. When we come back, I'll tell you, does this really then affect the impact of the historical Jesus in some way? In other words, because these exist, does that mean I no longer can trust what's been written in the New Testament about Jesus? We'll talk about that issue right after the break. Do you get a sense that censorship is rising? If we simply just reiterate the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, there's a good chance someone in the culture is going to see that as intolerant. I'm J. Warner Wallace, cold case detective and Christian casemaker. If you're concerned like I am about being deplatformed, about being canceled by a culture that has control over your mechanisms to interact with each other, and that's what it is with social media, then please join us at a private community we are building at coldcasechristianity.com. And I want you to join us if you're interested in being mentored, in being discipled in a way that will help you become a better Christian casemaker. It's a platform where you can know, is the Bible true and does it matter? Those two things will change your life. Join us at coldcasechristianity.com. You won't regret it. Okay, so there's all this nonsense written in the non-canonical gospel. This should be called the nonsensical gospels, but the point is the non-canonical gospels. Does all of this then challenge the historicity of the New Testament? We've written about this on our website as well, in an article simply called, Do the Non-Canonical Gospels Challenge the Historicity of the New Testament? And what I want to do here is give you three reasons why I don't think that the non-canonicals challenge the historicity of Jesus, even though I think they give us great data that we can mine from these gospels. If all you said was, I'm just going to look at the stuff that every one of these heresies, every one of these crazy stories, what is the stuff that they all hold to be true in common? And in Person of Interest, I talk about this, and I say, look, if you had all of the stories written about Elvis, do you realize that there's been at least one book written about Elvis every year since he died? And in the first few years, it was like several books a year were being written about Elvis. He died in the 70s, okay? Some of you don't even know who Elvis was because you're too young to know who Elvis is, but he was a recording artist. And there has been so much written about Elvis, probably most of which is not even true. But if you took every biography or story about Elvis and you put them all together and you just mined through all of them and said, well, what do all of these books at least hold in common? You'd get some minimalistic set of facts, set of data about Elvis Presley. And you find out that that's basically true. That stuff is true. Even though a lot of the other stuff's not true. The basic skeleton from which all of the lies were told, that stuff was true. And the same thing can be done with the story of Jesus from the non-canonicals. But let me give you 3 reasons why I do not think that the presence or existence or the use of the non-canonicals in history invalidates the New Testament. Here's the first one. The non-canonical Gospels, they just don't appear early enough to have an impact. Look, we talked about this before, right? The first criteria for an ancient book is it ancient enough to have been written by people who would have actually been there to see what they said they saw? It's the first criteria of eyewitness testimony. Were the witnesses truly present? Or at least we can put it this way: if they, having to be present early enough to write also means you're present early enough that whatever you do write about this guy would be debunked by those who knew better, because you're writing it early enough in history to have been written by somebody who actually saw it. That is not the case for the non-canonical Gospels. The earliest Gospel usually is probably going to be like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary. These are people, Gospel of Judas. Like I said earlier on this series, that it's interesting to me that given the poor manuscript evidence we have for those 3 Gospels, critics and skeptics still want to move them as early as they can on the timeline. And even though we have lots more manuscript evidence for the canonical Gospels, they want to move them later on the timeline. Why? Because they want you to think these are somehow competitive accounts that were then argued over historically. And just so happens that the version of Christianity that you guys like happened to win, even though there were lots of what Bart Ehrman would call lost Christianities. Well, is that really the case? Well, not really, because these are all too late in history. And it's only people who are skeptically trying to move them to earlier periods of time to make this case for lost Christianities. There's no good reason to believe that's true at all. The earliest of the 3, those 3 I mentioned, are still too late to have, they're right around 100 to or so, 100 AD. They're too late to have been written by eyewitnesses. And I make a case in Cold-Case Christianity for the early dating of the Gospels for this reason. You cannot make that kind of a case from internal or external evidence for any of the non-canonicals. The canonical Gospels, you can make a case for early dating. Now, I get it. Some people will say, well, I don't believe that case. Fine. You couldn't even begin to make that case for the non-canonicals. They are all simply too late in history to have been written by eyewitnesses. And that's why all I'm interested in is the stuff written by eyewitnesses. That's it. If it's not written by an eyewitness, why do I care what anybody says about it? I mean, you might as well read what I write about Jesus as Scripture. I'm not an eyewitness. Why would you care what I think? You got to look back and say, well, what's been written by those we can actually identify as eyewitnesses, and their writings are early enough to fit that actual truth. So that's the first thing. They are not written early enough. Second reason why I don't think they impact the New Testament at all is because the non-canonical Gospels were known to be fraudulent when they came out. Look, in the last episode of this 2-part on non-canonical Gospels, we talked about why even the Ante-Nicene Fathers, those who were in existence and leading the church prior to the Council of Nicaea, prior to Christianity becoming the religion of the empire, these folks saw these documents emerge in real time. And so they saw these things emerge in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. And as they were emerging, you know what they did? They basically called them out as fraudulent. You'll see this all the time. I've written on our website about this, that some of these are written, like Irenaeus, he's writing in about 185 AD, and he is talking about a number of non-canonical Gospels that are appearing now late in history. We are well after the period of time in which eyewitnesses could be accounting for these. Okay, we are very late in history. And here's what he called them: an indescribable number of secret and illegitimate writings, which they themselves have forged to bewilder the minds of foolish people, who are ignorant of the true scriptures. So, number one, they're written way too late in history. Number two, they were debunked in real time as they emerged, and the writings of the debunkers are still available to us. These are not a challenge to the truth of Christianity, because they were late forgeries, and they were called out as late forgeries by those who were there and who knew the truth. Third thing about why this does not challenge the historicity of the New Testament, and that's this. The non-canonical Gospels, they reflect ulterior motives. Look, they allowed their theological presuppositions to corrupt their work. We already talked about this a little bit, right? Whatever heretical view they held of the world, whatever view they held of that matter was vile and that only non-material things had value, they took those views of the world and they imported them into their discussion of Jesus. And you can see this. It's not as though Gnosticism is not obvious on the pages of the New Testament, of the non-canonical Gospels. You will see that Paul is even trying to make sure it doesn't get into the church. Well, why? Because everyone knows that this movement, this view of matter, this view of this private esoteric knowledge that only that if you don't have that knowledge, you cannot be joined to God, you cannot be saved, you cannot transcend the material world. Those views were then imported late into a story that corrupted Jesus as its authority. Hey, if we can't sell this on our own, let's just get Jesus to help us sell it. And that is happening a lot in the non-canonical Gospels. So you have three things you see happening in real time in history, which tell me, number one, it's way too late. Number two, it's being seen as a heresy in real time. And number three, you can tell what the motives are. They're from people who can see why they would want to corrupt the story. Doesn't surprise me that they have tried to corrupt the story. But here's the beautiful thing. You can actually reconstruct the story of Jesus from the lies, the same way you can reconstruct the story of Elvis from any exaggeration. If you have enough copies of exaggerations, I don't mean the same exaggeration, I mean everyone in these non-canonicals is lying about Jesus in a different way, but they have to stand on certain skeleton truth claims about Jesus in order to tell their elaborate lies. And when we reassemble those skeletal claims, you end up reassembling the canonical Jesus. So we talk about that, like I said, at length in our new book, Person of Interest. Please pre-order that. And thanks so much for watching and listening to this explanation of what the non-canonicals are. I remember when I first bought that book, The Lost Books of the Bible, I thought, is this going to show me something that is going to debunk Christianity? Instead, it just gives me more data from which I can reassemble the truth about Jesus. And I hope it does that for you as well. Thanks so much. I'll see you right here next time at Cold Case Christianity.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.